Back again YouTube, and this is going to be our third video within this segment, and I'm going to be calling this one our database access layer. The bit I want to tackle is our data or liquid ORM, and liquid is just a name that I've just given to it, and this directory is going to contain my interpretation, and I stress this is my interpretation of what I want my ORM to consist of. And what I want my ORM to consist of is a data mapper, and let's just create this directory, new folder. I'm going to call it data mapper, and this will contain some interfaces, it will contain some class, and it's also going to contain a factory pattern that I'm going to use to instantiate that data mapper object and pass in whatever argument that data mapper class requires to function. Like for example, the data mapper class will require that database connection, and so we're going to put that in. So what the data mapper is, it's like a wrapping class. It basically takes the method that PDO offers and it wraps around them, and that gives us the ability to use PDO in our own wrapper, in a central wrapper that we can then use within our framework. So we're keeping PDO in one place and we're wrapping method around PDO method so we can then use it. And again, this is my approach. This does not have to be your approach. You can take a completely different approach if you want. I mean, at the end of the day, web development is about getting result, and I'm trying to get the best result using the best possible practice, and still trying to maintain that loosely coupled structure that I'm trying to employ with my project. So that's what the data mapper class in my ORM is doing. It's basically a wrapping class that wraps around PDO method like prepared, bind values, execute, fetch all, fetch, and I'm basically wrapping those into my own method, which I then use in other parts of the project. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to create the necessary files that I need within this directory. And the first is going to be DataMapper interface .php. I'm going to need the actual DataMapper class .php. I'm also going to need DataMapper factory .php and a DataMapper environment configuration. And this file basically allows us to take in those database credentials that we mentioned in our database class, so we can get those credentials through our environment and pass it to our database class. So I mean, you will see that when we come to implement it. And likewise, I'm going to create a next directory called exception, and this is going to contain all of our exception class for our data mapper directory. Again, we're keeping everything separate, so because that's exactly what we're trying to employ. So in our interface, I want to go ahead and start creating the method that I'm going to require, or what we're going to require. Again, this is standard generic stuff. You should get used to this by now. We're declaring strict type at the top, namespace, magma, and again this time we're in a data mapper directory, and it's going to be an interface called data mapper interface. So the first method that I'm going to be putting in here is public, and it's going to be prepare. and this method is going to return self. And the reason why this is going to return self is if you are creating method that is chainable, then you need to return the object within that method, so you can chain on another method in that object onto this first method, if that makes sense. So this is how you create chainable method, by returning self. And this method takes one argument, which is going to be the SQL query, or the query that you're trying to execute. And self description again is a prepare the query string. And we're using prepared statements because we want to try and protect ourselves against any sort of like SQL injection, and prepared statements help us do that. It takes one param, which is a string, and it's going to be SQL query. Again, these are my variable name. You can name your variables however you want. It doesn't have to be SQL. It could be a simple query or SQL, but I've gone with SQL query. That's just preference. And so this is going to return self. Next method is going to be public function and bind. And this actually hasn't got a return type as of yet, because as of PHP 7.4.2 there is no return type for mixed data type, and this is what this method is going to return. The data type for this is going to be mixed. So I'm going to set it as value, because this value could be anything. It could be an array, it could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be a mix, different, well, it could be different data type. So as of PHP 7.4.2 there isn't a data type that we could specify for these type of values like mix. But I do believe in PHP 8 that's been rectified, and we have got this that we could use, but for the time being we can't use it because we're going to get an error. So PHP 8, we're going to come back to this and we're going to update it. So what this method does, it allows us to explicitly set our data type for the parameters using PDO param constants. And again, this particular method is best explained when we come to implementing the code, which we're going to be doing right after we implement these methods within our interface. So the third one is going to be bind parameters, and this is not part of PDO. This is a method that we implement that helps us to do certain things. And again, use your imagination a little bit. Well, you can't because you've not seen this code before, but you will see it when we come to implement it. And so it's going to be called, it's a public function called bind parameters, and this takes in a couple of arguments. And the first is an array of key value pairs, and the second is a boolean or a bool, which is going to say is search, and that's going to have a default value of false. All right, and this actually hasn't got a return type. Now let me just create these, then we'll build them out and see what they're actually returning. And the other method that we want in here is public function num_row. So if you work with PDO, you probably recognize this particular method, and I'm gonna actually call it the same as how PDO does it, just to not sort of like cause any confusion. And this returns an int. And next one is going to be execute. So be public function execute. And this method normally returns void. Well, it's void because it doesn't got a return type. It doesn't return anything. So I'm gonna set it at void. Say public function result. And this is where I've deviated a little bit, because instead of calling it fetch, I'm gonna call mine result. Like result singular returns a result, and I want this to return a singular result as an object. So we're gonna set the return type to object, and again, there's no arguments with this method. The second is going to be result, plural, and I want this to return a result of array. So it's going to be a return type of array, and an array of results, if that makes sense. And we're going to leave it like that for now, and we're going to actually jump within our data mapper. We're going to start coding these out. Declare strict type. Namespace be magma DataMapper class DataMapper implements DataMapper interface. So the first thing we actually want to do, I want to set our database property, because as I'm saying, this actual class requires a database to get the connection, so we can use the prepared statements and the bind method and stuff like that. So I'm going to create a property, and it's going to be a private property, and it's going to be our database connection interface, and I'm going to assign that DBH. So you see, we've typed in our database connection interface on this property. So we need to bring that class in as well. I'm going to use magma database connection database connection interface. Put message. It's just a little message. It don't have to if you don't want to. I just like to be a bit explicit. And second property we're going to create is also private, and it's going to be PDO statement. I'm going to use a abbreviation, and this is probably the only place I'm going to use abbreviation in my code. Normally I'm very explicit, but STMT normally just means statement, PDO statement. And let's also bring that in, PDO statement. Misspelling. And first we need to implement our constructor class, our constructor method. This will be construct, and we're going to type int our parsing or database interface, database connection interface, DB. And this is a little bit like dependency injection. This is what we're doing. We're injecting the dependency for this class within the constructor. And say this DBH equal DBH. So whatever we pass into this constructor, we're going to store it into this property, right? So, cool. And I want to actually create some helper function before we sort of like start implementing our prepared statement. So I want to actually check if stuff is empty before we sort of like start coding. So I'm going to write a small function. It's going to be private because it's going to be only implemented within this class. I'm going to say is empty. And we're going to say if empty, whatever value we put into this method, which is going to be value string error message. I'll set that to null because it's optional. And we're going to say value. Say throw new DataMapper exception, which we've not created yet, and we're going to pass that error message argument, so we can set our argument within our own custom DataMapper exception. And let's create that new file, DataMapper exception .php. We'll sort that. Well, let's just do it now. Let's just create the class, declare it, declare strict types, namespace, magma, and this DataMapper, and we're within that exception directory. So class to DataMapper exception, and we're going to extend exception, which is PDO exception. And I could do this, put a backtick, and that will work, but I like to use the use case and put my exception there, then take away that backtick. Both method will work. I just like to do mine like this. But we're going to actually implement a constructor and pass that message in so we can set custom message, but I will do that shortly. Go back to our class. So the method that we're going to create now is the first method is going to be our prepared method. So it's going to be public function prepare, passing the argument, which is a string, which is going to be the SQL or SQL query, and the return type is going to be self. And all this method is doing is we're going to store PDO object within this statement property. So it's going to be statement equal this DBH, which is our database connection, and we're going to call that open method that we created in our database, which is going to create a connection for us, a PDO connection, which then allows us to call the prepared method. And we're going to pass in our argument, which is going to be our SQL query, and return this. So, and that's the simplest implementation of our prepared statement. We're storing that object within this statement, so we can then use this statement to also call other PDO methods, which you will see later on down in the code. And the second one is going to be public function bind, and again this has got no data, has no return type, because the value that we're putting in here, it could be of any data type. So it's going to be, it could be string, an integer, could be a null. So there's no data type for it as of yet. In PHP 8 this has been addressed as far as what I've read. So we're going to use a try catch block with this, actually. Try catch and a PHP switch statement, because I want to switch through all the different possible data type that could be coming through and assign the correct PDO parameter to that data type. It's going to be value, and case. The first case we're going to check is bool, and we can use multiple case at once if we are expecting the same data type. So, and what I mean is bool value. If is the value a boolean, and let's say break, and we're going to store the return in this variable called data as pdo param int. So we're storing the data type within this variable, but we can also add a next use case onto this, because we're also expecting this integer to return an int. So I like killing two birds with one stone. And indent that. I'm going to say case, we're going to check is null, because data could be, the value could be null as well. And break, I'm going to say data equal pdo param null. Indent, and we can set our default return type, which is going to be a string. So I'm going to say data equal pdo param str break, and then we're simply just going to return the data type or the data. Actually, let's change that to data type. Let's copy and paste it over these, just so you know exactly what we're doing. Being explicit again, data type, and we're going to pass our same DataMapper exception within our catch block. And I'm just going to throw it. It's going to throw the exception. Right. So moving on, and these are the next method that we're going to implement is not actually part of the interface, but it's something that I didn't actually want to put in an interface. I just want to keep it out here in the main class. It's going to be a protected method, and it's an actual PDO equivalent. So it's going to be bind value, and this takes in an array of key value pairs. I'm going to call it fields, and I'm going to say, actually, let's create a next output method up here similar to this one. I'm just going to copy and paste that actually, because it's going to be quite similar. I'm going to call this one is array. So I want to check that the argument that we take in here is an array. I'm going to say this is array fields. So if it's not an array, we're going to throw an exception because it needs to be an array. We're going to say is the value an array. I'm going to take this off because we want to check in if it's an array. We're going to pass in an actual custom message, and what we're going to say is your argument needs to be an array. So if it's not an array, actually, if it's not an array, throw an exception. I need to add functions onto here. Right, so what this method does is, if you've worked with PDO, this is the bit where we sort of like bind the values to a parameter. And this is what this method does. So we've got an array of, well, the fields, we've got an array coming in as an argument, so we can loop over that. So we can say for each fields, and because it's a key value pair, it's an associative array, we can say as key value, and we're going to get this statement, yeah, pipe that onto bind, or chain onto bind value, or bind value, and we're going to implement this the way I implemented. You see other implementation where they use execute and return an array of key value pair. That is not how I'm going to implement it. I'm going to use the bind value to colon, and I'm going to concatenate the key, yeah, then the value. Then the third argument in this, for this method, this is a PDO method, the third argument is the data type, which we're going to get from this method. So we're going to pass that method in, this bind, and pass the value in. Then we're going to return this statement. Yep. Making all sorts of mistakes with this keyboard. Wow. Again, sorry about this. I'm gonna have to really sort of like go on Amazon in a minute, look at a decent keyboard, because this is not doing it for me. And that's the bind values. We call it bind values in our method, in our class, but we're sort of like mimicking PDO bind value. We're wrapping it in a way that we can pass in an associative array and just have it done for us, have it bind for us automatically. Again, you're gonna see where we're using all of these methods. What else have we got in our interface that we need to implement? Bind parameters. We can put that here. And as I said, this method takes in two arguments. The first is an array of, what do we call it? Of fields. And the second was a boolean called is search, and that was set to false. And the idea behind this is I've got my bind value method, which does simple binding to parameters, but at some point we're going to implement searching functionality within our application, and the binding for that is slightly different. So the is search key is essentially saying we can use this method in that function that we're going to create for searching, and we can set the key to true or false, and depending on whether it's true, we can return a different method. Let's just create it and you will see. So say public function and bind, oh sorry, we've got it already. What I want to say, if is array. So if it's an array, cool, good to go. We're going to say type equal is search, which is a ternary operator that we're working with, equal false. I'm going to say this bind values, passing that argument, fields. And so we're saying if search is set to false, then run this method. If it's not, then run a different method which we're going to create. So this, say bind search values, and that also takes the field as an argument. Then if type return this. So we're returning this, which, as I've said up here, if we're returning this, then it's a chainable method. So we want to return this, return self, and we want to actually put that in right here. Now we've established what we're going to be returning, which is self. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to set this to false down here, because if it's not an array, just kill it. You know, just don't go any further. So let's implement that bind search value, which is going to be pretty well. It's going to be exactly like this, a little bit of difference. So let's copy that. I'm going to change it to bind search value, and all that method does, it does something a little bit different. It introduces some wildcard for a search. So this bit stays the same, but all we're going to do is concatenate some percentage on either side of the value. So I'm going to say percent on this side, concatenate percent. And this will only make sense once you see how it's implemented in our searching. When we come to implement search capabilities, you will see what this actual method is doing, and I will print it out to the screen so you can see how these are what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead in a minute and I'm going to add some metadata or some description for these methods. What else do we need to create in here? We got our num row, we got our execute, so let's put them in. The public function execute, and we're going to say if this statement, we're going to say return this statement execute, and that's it. And say public function num rows, and say if this statement I'm going to return this statement chain on row count. Public function is going to be result, and I said this is going to return an object. I'm going to say this statement, and we're going to return this statement. We're going to fetch, and we're going to pass in PDO fetch object. So if we didn't pass that argument in, it would have fetched an array, because remember what we did in our database class, we've set a default fetch mode to fetch ASOC. And if we had not put that in, it would have fetched an array. But as I'm saying, I want my singular result to be an object. So public function results, and again that's going to be an array. I'm going to say if this statement, we're going to return this statement. Return this statement. I'm gonna go fetch all. And again, we can do the same thing. We can do that. Fetch a sock, and it will do the same as what we've defined as our default, or we can leave it off because it will default to that anyways. What else have we got? Yeah, so we've implemented all those methods that we've declared within our interface. We've now implemented them within our DataMapper class, and we've also gone ahead and done some other method that we will require within this class. So I've actually off screen I've just populated some description because I didn't actually want to have you guys watching me write these out. I mean, it's tedious stuff, but you know, it's something that I'm trying to implement from the very get-go. So, you know, as I said, I'm trying to build this out as an actual proper like project for production use. So I'm going about writing it as I'm going along. So I've done this off screen, and I've not made changes in terms of what we've done before, but what I've done, I've added a next method down here called getLastID, and this is going to be useful when we come to writing our application. And what it does is, for instance, if we're doing a create, inserting a create query string, we can actually fetch that ID off that last inserted query string. So we want to try and capture that. As I'm saying, it's going to be quite useful within our application. So I'm putting this in the DataMapper class because it's part of the PDO method that we can use. So I'm going to implement it in our DataMapper class. It's going to be public function get last ID. And so that is an int that it returns, and we're going to use a try catch block to catch any sort of like errors. So if we've got a database connection, or if it's still open or still persist, open, then I'm going to say last ID equal this dbh open last insert last insert ID, I believe it's called. And so if it's not empty, that variable that will just create last ID, if it's not empty, then return. And because we want it to be an integer, we're going to be explicit and says int val. So making sure that it's an integer that is being returned. And we're going to do a throwable in here. I'm going to say throwable. I'm going to throw it. And as far as as far as PHP are concerned, what they're saying is a throwable is the base interface for any object that can be thrown via a throw statement, including error and exception. Sounds a bit vague, but we're going to go with the throwable, and we're going to throw that. So throw whatever error that this method might get or might occur. So again, we've got all the description, and we're going to just inherit that from our interface, and we're going to actually say throws a throwable. Again, same thing for this. Inherit doc. Let's just copy this because we're going to be inheriting the doc for all of these methods. And inherit doc. Same for here. You can see I've got an error right here. Actually, I've got 2 E's. Should be 1. And what else have we got? We've got our bind parameter, which is part of our interface. We're going to inherit the doc for that. And bind value. So we haven't got that in our interface, so we need to write something for that. I'm going to say binds a value to a corresponding name or question mark. This is PDO exact description of this method. Mark placeholder and SQL statement. As I'm saying, it takes a single argument, which is an array, which we call fields, and it's returning a PDO statement, I think. Again, we'll check this when we come to implement it. If we get an error, we'll change it. So just want to see what it actually returns. And what we're throwing an exception, and that's going to be our DataMapper exception. You're probably wondering where that is coming from. That's coming from this method right here. This is array, because that's throwing that DataMapper exception. Now, when I was using PHP Storm, it sort of like was a bit of an open eye, because PHP Storm is quite dictative in how it wants you to code. So it will basically generate all this metadata for you, and this is how I come across stuff like this throw DataMapper or throw exception in methods that didn't actually have that exception. You're sitting there wondering, I was just throwing that, it's not in there. Then you realize that it's throwing it because you're probably using method within your method that already throws that exception, if you get what I'm saying. So that's how we're going to approach it in terms of how we're writing our metadata for our method, so you can see what it's actually doing. So we're throwing a DataMapper exception, and that's coming from this method right here, isArray, because that's throwing that DataMapper exception. This also is inheriting that doc. Same with this. Again, like, you can just quickly fast forward through this if you want, and we'll catch back up on the next bit. So quickly run over this. Just making sure that we've not missed anything. We've not got any little silly errors. So that looks good for now.